My name is Claire Bennett, and there are moments in life when time does not move forward, it collapses inward, folding grief over itself until you can no longer tell whether you are breathing in the present or suffocating in memory. The day my son died was one of those moments. His name was Ethan. He was 17 years old, tall for his age, with the same dark eyes as his father and the same stubborn kindness that had always made my heart ache with pride. When the police knocked on our door just after midnight, I already knew something was wrong.
A mother always knows.
They spoke carefully, gently, as if softness could soften the words that followed. Car accident. Instant.
Nothing could be done. I remember my knees giving out.
I remember screaming my son's name until my throat burned. I remember my husband Mark standing frozen beside me, not crying, not moving, as if grief had missed him entirely. From that moment on, our house became a place where silence lived. Ethan's room stayed untouched. His shoes remained by the door. His jacket still hung on the chair. I slept with his hoodie pressed against my face just to feel something that reminded me he had existed. Mark, however, withdrew in a different way. He stopped looking at me. He stopped touching me. He stopped saying our son's name. In the days after the accident, people filled our home with casseroles, whispered condolences, awkward hugs. Mark thanked them politely, efficiently, like a man managing a business crisis instead of mourning a child. At night, when the house was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table scrolling on his phone while I cried in the bedroom alone. I told myself grief looks different for everyone. I told myself not to judge him. But something inside me had already begun to shift. 2 days after Ethan's death, I overheard Mark on the phone in the garage. His voice was low, controlled. I was not trying to listen, but when you lose a child, your senses sharpen whether you want them to or not. I heard him say, "I can't do this anymore. This isn't the life I want." There was a pause, then softer words I could not fully hear. Then, "Don't worry. I'll handle it after the funeral. After the funeral." I stood there, my hand gripping the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. That night, I did not confront him. I did not ask questions. Grief had stripped me raw, but it had also given me clarity. If Mark was planning to leave me, he had already decided. Begging would change nothing. Crying louder would change nothing. Instead, I did something I had never done before in our 20-year marriage. I stayed silent. The next morning, while Mark went out under the excuse of handling paperwork, I called a lawyer. Her name was Susan Miller. She listened to my story without interrupting, without pity, only focus. I told her about the accident. I told her about the phone call. I told her about the growing sense that my marriage had been quietly ending long before my son died. Susan asked me one question that still echoes in my mind. "Claire, do you trust your husband right now?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said no. That was the moment everything changed. Over the next 2 days, while the world saw me as a broken mother barely functioning, I signed documents. I secured accounts. I protected what little remained of my life. I did not do this out of revenge. I did it out of survival. Because losing a child breaks you, but being abandoned at your weakest can destroy you completely. Before I continue, I want to say something to anyone listening. If you have ever been betrayed at your lowest point, if you have ever been forced to choose between collapsing and standing quietly back up, I invite you to stay with me, to share your thoughts in the comments, to like this story, and to subscribe. Some stories are not told to shock, but to remind us that strength does not always scream. Sometimes it prepares. The day of the funeral arrived wrapped in gray skies and cold air. Ethan's coffin was small. Too small. I remember thinking that no parent should ever have to look at something that contains their child. People lined the church pews. Friends. Teachers. Teammates. Mothers holding their sons a little too tightly.
Mark sat beside me, stiff, distant.
When people approached us, he nodded, accepted condolences, thanked them. When they spoke to me, I felt like I was underwater, hearing voices through glass. Halfway through the service, as the pastor spoke about Ethan's kindness, Mark leaned closer to me. His voice was calm, almost businesslike. "Claire, we need to talk after this." I did not look at him. About what? I whispered. About us, he said. My chest tightened. Not today, Mark. He exhaled sharply. There's never a good time.
I closed my eyes.
There is a wrong time. He said nothing more. At the graveside, as Ethan was lowered into the ground, my legs nearly gave out. I felt hands supporting me. I heard sobs.
I heard my own voice break as I whispered goodbye to my son.
When it was over and people began to drift away, Mark did not offer his arm. He did not ask if I was okay. Instead, he stepped slightly away from me, as if creating space for what he was about to do. Claire, he said quietly, I can't stay in this marriage. The words felt unreal, floating, disconnected from the scene around us.
At my son's funeral.
I turned to look at him. His face was composed, determined, almost relieved. I stared at him, and for a moment, I felt nothing. No shock. No anger. Just an overwhelming sense of confirmation.
This is who you are.
This is when you choose to leave. He continued speaking, but his words blurred together. I need to start over.
I am not happy.
We've been broken for a long time. I deserve more than this. I wanted to laugh at the word deserve. Instead, I nodded slowly. He looked surprised. You're not going to say anything. I met his eyes for the first time in days. No, Mark. I already did. Just not out loud. He frowned, confused, but before he could ask what I meant, someone called his name. He stepped away, assuming the conversation was finished. It was not. It had only just begun. As I stood there beside my son's grave, I placed my hand over my heart and felt something steady beneath the grief. Not peace. Not yet. But readiness. Mark believed he was leaving me at my lowest. He believed I was powerless, broken, dependent. What he did not know was that days before I buried my son, I had already buried the version of myself that would beg a man to stay. And what he did not yet understand was that the decisions I made in silence were about to change everything. After the funeral ended and the last guests slowly walked away, the cemetery fell into a quiet that felt almost violent. The wind moved through the bare trees, carrying the sound of distant traffic, life continuing as if my world had not just collapsed. Mark stood a few steps away from me, checking his phone, already halfway gone. I stayed where I was, my eyes fixed on the fresh mound of earth that now held my son. I did not cry anymore. The tears had burned themselves out. What remained was a hollow stillness, the kind that scares people because it looks like strength when it is really shock settling into bone. Mark cleared his throat. I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight, he said, not meeting my eyes. We'll talk about logistics later. Logistics. As if the last 17 years of our lives together could be reduced to schedules and boxes. I nodded again. Okay. He hesitated, clearly expecting something else. Anger. Begging. Questions. When none came, he seemed unsettled. Claire, he said, don't make this harder than it has to be. I finally looked at him then.
Harder than burying our child.
He flinched, but said nothing. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone beside my son's grave. That was the moment I truly understood that grief had not brought us together, it had exposed what was already broken. In the days that followed, Mark moved quickly. He packed a suitcase, took his laptop, his important documents. He avoided me entirely, communicating only through short messages about practical matters. I let him. I watched him leave the house that still smelled like our son, the house where I slept with Ethan's hoodie pressed against my chest, and I felt something inside me go cold. Not hatred.
Resolution.
On the third day after the funeral, Mark sat across from me at the kitchen table. He looked impatient, as if this conversation were an unpleasant task to get through. I've spoken to a lawyer, he said. I almost smiled. So have I. He frowned slightly. We need to divide assets fairly, he continued.
The house, the accounts, everything.
I nodded. Of course. He leaned back, relieved by my calmness. I assumed you'd be emotional about this. I folded my hands in front of me. I already was. Now I'm organized. He didn't understand what I meant, but he didn't ask. Mark had always underestimated silence. He believed power belonged to the one who spoke first, who dominated conversations, who announced decisions. He did not realize that while he was planning his exit, I had already protected myself. The next week passed in a blur of paperwork and emptiness. Friends checked in. Some knew what Mark had done. Some didn't. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't explain. I focused on surviving the mornings, the afternoons, the nights. I went back to Susan's office once more. She reviewed everything carefully, nodding as she flipped through documents. "You did the right thing," she said quietly.
Timing matters.
I stared at the window. "I didn't plan to need this," I said. "No one ever does," she replied. Mark, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. He expected confrontation. He expected drama. Instead, he got compliance and distance. One evening he called me, his voice sharp. "Why are you being so calm about this?" I paused before answering. "Because I don't have the energy to fight you, Mark. And because fighting isn't how I'm going to survive this." He scoffed. "You're acting like you're in control." I didn't respond. Control had nothing to do with noise. A few days later, he came by the house unannounced. He stood in the doorway, scanning the room like a stranger. "This feels weird," he said. "Like you're already gone." I met his gaze evenly. "Maybe you should have thought about that before leaving me at our son's funeral." He looked away. "I told you, I couldn't stay in something that was killing me."
I nodded slowly.
"And you chose the moment that killed me most to say it." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't apologize. He never did. What he didn't know was that while he was focused on his own relief, consequences were already unfolding. 2 days later, Mark received an email from his lawyer. I wasn't there when he read it, but he called me immediately afterward, his voice tight with confusion.
"What did you do, Claire?"
I kept my tone neutral. I followed legal advice. His breath quickened. "You can't just make decisions without me." "I can," I said calmly, "when they protect me." Silence stretched between us. He had expected me to collapse. He had expected to leave me broken and dependent, scrambling to keep whatever scraps he allowed me. Instead, he was realizing that the version of me he had abandoned no longer existed. That night, I walked into Ethan's room for the first time since the funeral. I sat on his bed, tracing the edge of his pillow, and whispered, "I'm still here. I don't know how, but I am." And in that moment, I understood something painful and necessary.
Losing my son had shattered my heart.
Losing my husband had freed me from the illusion that I needed him to survive. Mark still believed he was the one who ended our marriage. He still believed he had walked away with power, dignity, choice. He had no idea that days before he broke up with me at our son's funeral, I had already taken steps that would redefine what he could and could not take from my life. And the moment he finally understood that truth was coming soon. He just didn't know it yet. The moment Mark finally understood that I had acted days before the funeral came quietly, without drama, the way real consequences usually do. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when he showed up at the house again, this time without confidence, without that air of relief he had worn since leaving me at our son's grave. He stood in the living room like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, eyes scanning the walls, the photographs, the small signs of a life that no longer centered around him. He cleared his throat and said his lawyer had questions. I nodded and invited him to sit, the same way I would invite a neighbor, polite and distant. He asked when I had planned everything. I told him the truth. 2 days after Ethan died. He stared at me in disbelief. "You were planning this while we were still burying our son." I corrected him calmly. "I was protecting myself while you were planning to leave me." He shook his head, frustrated. "That's not fair." I almost laughed. Fair was standing beside me at the worst moment of my life. Fair was choosing compassion over convenience. You chose neither. He tried a different angle then, softer, almost pleading. "We could still handle this amicably. I don't want this to get ugly." I met his eyes and said something I had practiced in silence for weeks. "It isn't ugly, Mark. It's finished." He asked if I hated him. I thought about it carefully before answering. "No. I don't have the energy for hate anymore. I have boundaries. That word unsettled him more than anger ever could. Boundaries meant I was no longer accessible to his guilt, his justifications, his need to feel like the good guy in a terrible story. He left shortly after, shoulders tense, jaw tight, realizing for the first time that the woman he thought he was abandoning had already walked away from him internally. In the months that followed, the world slowly returned in pieces. Mornings became bearable.
Nights less suffocating. I learned how to exist with grief without letting it define every breath. I kept my routine simple.
Therapy on Thursdays.
Long walks in the early evening.
I talked to Ethan out loud when the house felt too quiet, telling him about small victories, about the way I was learning to stand again. Mark tried to reach out a few times, not to reconcile, but to soften the ending, to rewrite the narrative in a way that hurt less. I did not engage. Closure is not something another person gives you. It is something you claim when you stop needing explanations. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers, I found a note Ethan had written years earlier, a silly list titled Things I Want to Do Before I'm 30. At the bottom he had written, "Make Mom proud." I sat on the floor and cried, not with the sharp pain of the early days, but with something quieter, heavier, and strangely steadier. I understood then that surviving was not a betrayal of my son's memory. Living was not disloyalty. Choosing myself was not abandonment. It was honor. Mark eventually signed the final papers without a fight. By then, he had realized there was nothing left to take that I was willing to give. The day our divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse alone and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift just enough to remind me that air still existed. I did not win. I did not celebrate. I simply continued. And that was enough. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. People reveal who they are when life is unbearable. Some run. Some stay. And some prepare quietly, not to punish, but to survive. If you have ever been left at your lowest, if you have ever been betrayed when you needed love the most, know this. Silence can be strength. Preparation can be self-respect. And letting go does not mean you lost.
It means you chose to live.
Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. Like this video if you believe dignity should never be optional. Subscribe for more real, cinematic stories about grief, resilience, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. And if you're standing in the middle of loss right now, hear me clearly. You are not weak. You are becoming.